Welcome back for our final keynote of the symposium. As one of the most trusted bloggers in sport and fitness, Rainmaker goes beyond what is currently happening and shares his views from the proverbial crystal ball on what consumers are asking for and what will keep companies in the game. Join Ray this afternoon as he addresses the past, the present, and the future state of sport and fitness technology. Discover what matters most to consumers, explore key market trends, and learn tips and tricks to make your product and or service successful in the wearable world. Returning to the ANT Symposium, from DC Rainmaker, welcome, Rainmaker.
So again, thank you very much for the time, and I'm looking forward to talking about sports technology here. And we're going to start off with a little bit about what the site is. I recognize that the vast majority of you probably know about the site, so I'm going to scream through this slide and the next slide. But for those of you that don't, because I know there's now folks here from other industries and stuff, so I'll just kind of briefly talk about this. But the site essentially began as a personal blog 11 years ago now. And it's become, more about in-depth sports technology. Obviously, if I had known that it'd be more than like 6 people reading it, I probably would have named it something other than DC Rainmaker, but that's what I went with. And today it's about 4 million or so page views a month, with about 3 million unique people per month swinging by reading content. And it's across a wide variety of different geographies, as well as kind of market consumer types we'll talk about in a second. One of the things I do want to mention at the very end, though, of this slide is kind of how I produce revenue, because it's without question the most common question I get every time I give this presentation at night, at the dinner later on tonight, and every single year. It's really interesting. So for me, all my revenue is produced on affiliate links, which means that if you go to Amazon and you buy toilet paper after clicking my link, or you buy a GPS watch, then that's how I get paid from Amazon and others like that. I don't take any advertising revenue from the people in this room or any other companies that I review. The only advertising you see on there is from Google AdSense. So if you're searching for lingerie, you get lingerie ads, or searching for vacations in Mexico, you get Mexico ads and things like that. So keeps it really nice and simple. And the other big misconception is that it's all fitness geeks that read the site. And that actually couldn't be kind of further from the truth. In a lot of ways, it's people starting off doing 5Ks. It's people looking for basic activity trackers. Depending on the time in the season, like right now, going in October, the vast majority of the volume of traffic to my site is for people looking for Fitbits. So that shows you, like, it's not all people with 5 power meters and 4 trainers and stuff like that. It's across the entire spectrum, all the way up to Olympians. So it's definitely everywhere. And of course, beyond that, it's people in the industry, so people like yourselves that are reading, as well as mainstream tech and mainstream publications, whether it be the New York Times or BBC or any of those sites that are looking for sort of advice and content on the products that they themselves might be reviewing. You'll see many, many cases where kind of mainstream media will eventually point to some peace of mind after their review itself. And so that's kind of the realm of people that I focus on. And then what do I focus on is sort of all over the map, like what is sports technology? And my definition is essentially it's something that has like a chipset inside. There's some sort of electronic component to it. Now, of course, if you go to like a bike trade show, everything from like textiles to just raw bikes are considered sports technology, depending on who you ask. But for me and for what I review, it has to have some sort of chipset in it. So typically that's a wearable, it's a cycling device, it's swimming devices, it's action cameras and drones and things like weight scales and all that kind of stuff. But even wearables, it's just, there's a huge volume of things that what we call a wearable. On the right-hand side, you can see a ton of those there, whether it be wrist-based devices, upper arm-based devices, chest-based devices, foot-based devices, e-textiles. I mean, there's just, it goes on and on and on. But that's what's cool about it. I get to play with all these things, and I'm essentially like a professional athlete without being fast. So it's the greatest thing ever. I get to work out every day, and it's perfect. So in looking at working out every day, just a bit of a normal bike ride to kind of put things in perspective for you. So this is me back in July riding up the Stelvio in Italy there, famous cycling pass for those of you that aren't cyclists, but kind of a normal ride. This particular ride, I had 3 power meters on me, 3 bike computers, 3 separate heart rate sensors beyond the 2 GPS watches I was wearing, so I had chest straps and 2 different armband straps. I had 2 tire pressure sensors. I had bike lights, but they're actually not in this picture because they weren't released at the time, so I put them in my back pocket for this photo, so I had something for Instagram. There's a connected helmet, electronic gear shifting, speed sensor, action camera, and a drone, all in that picture somewhere either in my back pockets or whatnot. So when people are like, oh, I rode the Stelvio, I'm like, oh, that's cute. What do you have with you? So this is all the crap I hold up the Stelvio. Now, before we get into what the future looks like, we have to talk about who we lost this year. So the annual list of sports technology players that didn't make it to this year, basically, didn't make it to this symposium. This is kind of how I draw the line in the sand, or the snow as it may be outside, as to whether or not they're here. And I think, on the right-hand side, we have the companies that we lost last year, so some of those you may not remember we lost, but they're gone now. And left-hand side, we've got those that are gone now. So like one of the first ones is Mio Wearables. Different from Mio Cycling, by the way. It's different company. Mio Wearables made like the old Alpha watches and stuff like that. They simply didn't innovate fast enough, and as a result, they're no longer here. TomTom Wearables, kind of the same thing. I think in TomTom's case, they were actually making good products, but ultimately, you have to make new products every year. Releasing the same watch with a slightly new firmware update does not constitute a new product, not when you do it 3 years in a row. So that was sort of their lost. Level, LVL. So they were on the list last year for almost dead, not dead yet. And I'm not sure where they sit precisely. I think it's kind of like, when a boat goes out to sea and they unfortunately are lost for a while, like at what point do you call them gone, or are they still alive if they're gone for 3 or 4 months? I think that's kind of like what the case with Level. In this case, they haven't posted on their Kickstarter campaign in 4 months now, and the previous update to that was many months before then. I'm pretty sure we can consider them dead now. They're already 2 years behind their schedule, so they're gone, unfortunately. Oakley Pace and New Balance Wearables, both casualties of Intel. And of course, Intel went away last year from a wearable standpoint, and those 2 companies depended entirely on Intel for their entire product. And of course, there are more running efficiency companies than I can possibly count. There are so many that went on to crowdfunding campaigns and things like that are all gone now. Now, who's still on life support? I'll just do this for fun. So I think we've got at the bottom there, Mio Cyclo, which is different than Mio Wearables. Mio Cyclo is a different company, kind of has Magellan as a bit of background there. They did release something this summer, but again, it kind of followed on the TomTom realm of just taking an existing unit, putting new firmware on it, and calling it new, which isn't going to work in this day and age from a consumer standpoint. I'll talk about that just in a second. And then Under Armour Wearables. So obviously Under Armour bought everyone and then tried to do something with it, and they made hardware that nobody wanted. And then now they're there. And so I'm not sure what the solution is for them. Maybe they can buy some more companies and something will happen, I don't know. But either way, I think they're on the life support from a wearable standpoint. So this is a running track, and I note this in context of the previous slide. Now, obviously, it's a running track. It's actually one right near my house, the Olympic Stadium in Amsterdam. And the way I look at whether or not a company is dead, in some respects, is how involved in the industry they are. So not so much are they here at this event. That's certainly an important checkbox. But are they at any events? Or are they making some sort of announcements in the industry? Now, this may sound obvious, but I think it's something that a number of companies miss. And I'll kind of give 2 examples of this. So if I start off the year, if this entire running track is a calendar year, the very bottom right-hand side there, we have the start line, and we have CES in January, first or second week in January. That's a major industry event. That's one that if you're in the wearables industry, you're likely to be there. And then we kind of round out into Sea Otter there on the cycling side of things. That's in April. There's, of course, other events there as well. Obviously, the Boston Marathon is popular for the running side of life. And we go into summer there on the top-hand side. We have Eurobike, and then we have Interbike, and then we have the ANT Symposium. In between those events, I hope to hear from you, and consumers hope to hear from you. And if you get to now, here we are on whatever it is, October 3rd or 4th, and I haven't heard from you in this entire year, and the consumers haven't heard from you for new products, that's pretty worrying. And so to give 2 examples of this, we have Favero, who makes power meter pedals, and they are not here at this event today. They're from Italy. But if I look at this track, CES isn't applicable to them, that's fine, but in February, they released a new firmware update. They made some more noise with some more updates in the April timeframe. At Eurobike timeframe, they made more noise with more firmware updates. They're talking about yet another firmware update just a few weeks ago. So throughout this entire process, while they weren't technically at those events, they were making enough noise that people knew they were releasing new products and knew they were still relevant, and therefore they've checked off the box of are they still alive. On the flip side, another power meter company, Power2Max, which arguably has larger market share than Favero, has skipped every single event here. Like, I haven't heard from them since last summer. And I sit there from my standpoint, from a general media standpoint, from a consumer standpoint, and go, are they still alive? Like, if you're a major European power meter company and you're not at Eurobike, that's probably a concern. And if you don't make any announcements across the entire spectrum of the last 12 months, that's probably a concern. Because you have to remember, you're ultimately tech companies. As much as you may want to be cycling companies or running companies, everyone in this room is a tech company. You're at a wireless summit. Therefore, you have to act like a tech company. And a traditional tech company can't get away with not announcing something or doing something for a year or two and just hoping that consumers don't notice. So let's talk about trends a little bit in 2018. And this is kind of a super high level, and we'll dive into a bunch of these over the next 38 slides. So I got an hour, right? Actually, I got like an hour and a half now because we started 15 minutes early or something, so we'll be all good. Nobody's going to be telling me to get off the stage this year. So music is obviously becoming essential in wearables. We've seen that through presentations today. We can see that in everything we look at. Contactless payments are becoming normalized in wearables. I don't necessarily think they're essential yet at this point in time, mostly because the infrastructure behind them, not behind the wearable, but behind the entire banking ecosystem and just going to a gas station, whether or not you can even use that contactless payment isn't really there yet in all countries. So I don't think it's absolutely required. I do think it's something that sets wearables apart, though. So I do think it's something that you look at and go, yes, that does have it, or this doesn't have it. So that's something to keep in mind. I also think it's important when you look at a product lineup, and if products that are above a certain price point don't have it, but products that are lower than a certain price point do have it, to me, that's awkward. Wearables becoming medical devices, I'll dive plenty into this. Nobody still cares about swimming devices. That's just the general trend that we've seen for years now. Making a swimming device is really, really difficult in this market, and I think because swimmers don't tend to like technology and other things on their body when they're swimming, especially in the pool. And so it's really, really tough to see standalone swim companies succeed in the sports technology realm. Bike GPS mapping becoming popular, and I'm sure Garmin would say, of course, we've been doing this for years. And that's true, you have, but now everyone else is doing it too. And so now it's becoming kind of this thing to do, and so I'll dive into that a little bit. Aero devices, I got lots of slides on aero devices. Trainer apps are becoming training apps. So there are no longer a case where the fact that you're just controlling a trainer and setting a wattage, that's not like the baseline anymore. You have to do more than just controlling that particular trainer to be relevant in this market these days. And of course, trainers are becoming silent. They've gotten quieter and quieter and quieter. I think now we look at the announcements at Eurobike, and kind of that standard is that trainer silent? Like with the exception of the drivetrain, is it actually silent? Running power, I think we're seeing stuff where it's both finding its way and losing its way at the same time. And then running efficiency metrics from other companies, from a lot of companies, have simply just evaporated. Like the whole idea that you can pitch a $200 running efficiency device to couch to 5K people just doesn't work. And I think those companies have realized that, and they've spent a lot of money realizing that. And so you've got to align the product with the target market. We've seen some cool stuff with GPS battery life. So in particular, I really liked what Suunto did with their Suunto 9 series to be able to do GPS-less tracking. So they can take a point every 2 minutes. They turn off the GPS for 2 minutes at a time, and they produce an actual GPS track, like a squiggly line. And is it absolutely perfect? No. But it's really close, and it's really, really darn cool. Now, on the flip side of that, they also use new GPS chipsets. And when they turn the GPS on, things aren't as awesome anymore. And Polar is now facing the exact same thing with their new watches that are also using the exact same chipset that Suunto switched to. So we're seeing cases where companies are chasing battery life, but maybe too much at the expense for GPS accuracy. And then I think we're also seeing a bit of a renewed focus on heart rate accuracy. Obviously, heart rate became like a dial tone thing over the last couple of years, but accuracy wasn't always at the forefront of that. We've seen Polar now with the new Vantage series has 9 LEDs in the back of their optical sensor. Like I would imagine the brainstorming session that went through at Polar to get to 9 LEDs. Like, you typically start off like 2 or 3, and then they're like, no, 4, 5, 6, I raise you to 7, 8, 9. Yes, we shall do 9, right? And that's where they ended. And to be fair, the accuracy is really good. Like in all my testing, it's still technically beta, but all my testing, not bad, Polar, not bad. So I think we're seeing that sort of refocus on heart rate accuracy and the fact that it does actually matter to a lot of people. We're also seeing this move beyond data capture. So like last year, I put up these left-hand side metrics there as things that were becoming common, right? Whether it be stress or sleep quality or fitness age or recovery and all this kind of stuff. Now we're getting to the point of actually just doing something with all that data as opposed to just simply capturing it and putting it in a graph. So Fitbit's talked about their new sleep quality stuff and taking in not just one data point, but multiple data types and merging that together to produce a dashboard around that, which I think is the key difference, right? So a lot of these metrics on the left-hand side are singular data metrics, right? They're a singular data point that you've in the past may have graphed, but now you're going ahead and taking that and merging it with different pieces of that puzzle and actually coming to some sort of conclusion about what's going on in that person's life based on multiple data points. And I think this is definitely the trending that will go forward, and I'm excited about this because I think it's actually making that data useful and making something from that data. I think like what Garmin's doing with battery is another area that is becoming more interesting. And it's fascinating, right? In the case of Garmin and body battery, that's technically the exact same technology that Suunto has in their Suunto 3 Fitness, but it's just not displayed as well, right? And that shows you the importance of how you display something. So they're both leveraging the same first beat modules beneath the covers, but Garmin's displaying that in such a better way that it actually makes the data valuable. Whereas what Suunto's done with that data when they display it, you just kind of shrug. And so that shows you the power and the value of the platforms on top of that. And if you don't have those platforms there, it's really hard to go ahead and make that consumer utilize and make use of that data. So which standards, since we're here at a standards kind of event, which standards actually standardized? And I always talk about standards, for the last 8 years I've talked about standards at this event. And I think the most important thing is really that top line. If you're a startup company and you're trying to get in the sports tech realm and you're not adopting standards, there's no question in my mind you will fail. Without question, you will fail. And it's so obvious. Like I talked to a company a couple weeks ago on a conference call, and I've kind of mentioned this, a couple people in the room here. I had this Skype call, and I was at home, and I had this company that was talking with, it was a head unit company, and they had this idea to talk with aero sensors. And they're all in this conference room in front of me on a Skype call, all the way around the table. And they said, we're going to go ahead and we're going to develop a connection with these aero sensors. We're going to develop our own protocol, likely on Bluetooth Smart, and we're going to do it all with this aero company. What do you think about it? And they were so excited to tell me this. And I just looked at them, totally straight-faced. I'm like, I think it's the worst idea ever. And it was, because what they were suggesting doing was to reinvent the wheel. Reinvent not just the wheel that's generated here, but reinvent a lot of wheels. That's the whole point of standards, to save them that time. Why would they waste all that dev time across any protocol they want to reinvent that wheel when it already exists or is at least pretty far down the way of existing? And I think it's important for startups. If there's any takeaway that any startups that are either here today or watching this video down the road, don't reinvent the wheel. Adopt those standards. They'll get you much, much further along. And I think we're seeing that. Cycling dynamics is something that I know is really close. It was announced, of course, last year at the summit. I think it's close to being in a realm where other companies can leverage it, hopefully by the end of this year for some of those companies. Single-sided power, though, is actually funny. So this is one that I would never have expected I would have had to talk about, which is single-sided power meters talking to apps and head units on primarily Bluetooth, but also a little bit of ANT+, where I'm seeing this weird resurgence of issues in the last 3 to 6 months. And that's something that I've seen cases where someone will use a single-sided power meter and it doesn't double or does double correctly or incorrectly, depending on what the scenario is, to apps. And it's kind of this weird gray area of why are the standards falling apart there? And I think those are areas that some of you guys are having to kind of contend with your user base. So I'm interested to see that get resolved over time. in terms of like trainer standards, things like ANT plus FEC is completely commonplace now. That is, across the board, the standard for integrating with trainers across ANT plus. Bluetooth FTMS is getting there. It's not, of course, adopted by everyone. A lot of companies are getting there, but at the same time, those that are on that train to get there have found out that that train is a bit messy at times, and some of the things don't quite work as well as they should between apps and trainers, and so that's definitely a tougher area. The last one there is funny though, so running dynamics. Of course, the running dynamics standard was standardized, solidified over the last year or so, and no one's adopted it. Like, it's one of those things where, consumers complain to companies that, Garmin had lockdown running dynamics, and so those companies complained to me, and then I complained to everyone here in this room last year, and then come full circle, the same companies that were complaining about not having run dynamics access have decided, no, we're not gonna implement it. So it's one of those things where you can't have it both ways, right? You can't complain about not having a standard, not being part of the standard, and then when it gets there, not actually take advantage of it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this over the next while. Speaking of running efficiency stuffs, so running power. It's definitely, the market's expanding. Obviously, we saw Polar introduce running power, I guess 3 or 4 weeks ago now, on the wrist itself. And that's notable because up until now, running power has required some sort of sensor pod thing from some company, whether it be a chest strap or a running pod in your shoe or a sensor, whatever it may be. It required another accessory, whereas Polar is going ahead and putting it directly in the wrist itself, and they believe they can get accurate data from the wrist itself. And we'll talk about accuracy in just a second. But I think you basically have essentially 4 companies that matter at this moment in time in this segment. There's plenty more doing running power, but these are the 4 that I think matter. The question is whether or not this actually matters to the larger population. And it's funny, like if you look at the Garmin Connect IQ insights for the different running power apps, it's like a very, very small amount. Like Garmin's running app is 20-some odd thousand downloads, Stride's in the same ballpark, RunScribe, it's much more than that. So you look at those numbers and go, well, as a volume or as a fraction of the total number of watches out there that are capable of using running power, that's like not even a 1%. That's like well under the 1% category. So does it really matter? And I think part of that is the fact that apps downstream from that don't support that. And Nick talked earlier about how a couple years ago I said I was concerned about fit file standardization, the fact that you could write developer fields to fit files. Yeah, see, Nick, this is the trick, right? So if I go later in the day, yeah, I got time. Gotta think these things through. So he talked about the fact that a couple years ago I complained about my concern with the developer fields and apps to be able to write developer fields, write content developer fields, and that would kind of skew things about a bit. And to be fair, like I was definitely concerned about that, and I think I like what I see with developer fields in general. I think the fact that there's 300 apps out there today that can go ahead and write to developer fields is awesome, and I use that functionality, and a lot of the aero companies use that functionality today. But, and this is where the but is, in the case of running power in particular, this has hurt that industry. Without question, this has hurt that industry. So in this case, right, you have no native ability to train by running power zones. You have no native ability to do longer-term trend tracking against running power in the case of Garmin's platform. You don't get any PR-related metrics, and there's a long list of other things beyond this. And so in this particular case, that running power field has become fragmented, where you have these players here that can't really get equal access to the same thing. And in this scenario, the best running power experience is actually on Suunto and soon on Polar, which is ironic because Garmin had all these players available to them sooner than that. So that's an example where standardization can help, and developer fields are awesome, and I absolutely think they should continue, but you also have to make sure that you're not kind of shoehorning folks into this sort of secondary solution. And that's why I'm excited if you look at like where Aero is going, that I think we're not repeating the same thing there. I think, as I'll talk about with Aero, definitely focus on having a TWG around Aero, standardizing that up front and getting out the door. I do think, though, that running power in some ways won't succeed until there is that standard around that. And I know there isn't like a huge rush to get there at this point in time, but I think it's going to continue to kind of flounder a bit. And I think that's something that it's too bad. I do think polars moving it to the wrist will make a difference, though. I think the fact that people can just go out for a run and will just see it there automatically will make a difference. And they don't have to like add extra pods or download apps. It just works. That's a big deal. The other challenge with running power is they just disagree. So this is a run from a couple weeks ago in San Francisco. This has on it the Garmin running power, Stride running power, and Polar's running power. Yeah, so they should all theoretically be this. Like if I was testing power meters, these would all be the same, right? Or within like a % or so of each other. No matter how far back in the room you are, you can see these aren't the same, right? It doesn't really matter what the numbers are, they're all not the same. And the challenge is that every company says they've validated their power numbers with running power. And in some cases, some of these companies have gone to the same exact labs, like the exact same labs in Colorado, on force plate treadmills, and said they validated their power meters. How? Like I don't understand. Like if I go, no, this is not an anomaly, by the way. This is every single run I have. They're all different. And so I don't think, until there's some sort of vague agreement with this, there won't be trust by coaches. And until there's trust by coaches, the coaches aren't going to tell their athletes to go ahead and use that technology. And until that happens, people aren't going to use this technology. And so I think there has to be some sort of effort between the companies that I had in the previous slide to come together, have a powwow, and figure out how to start defining running power. And that's going to hold back that industry. It's as simple as that. So switching over to cycling for a little while. So I think we've seen a bit of a shift from 2017 to 2018 in terms of where the battles are. In 2017, the battle was definitely that mid-range. Like there was the war between Garmin and Wahoo for that $250-ish price point. In that case, the Edge 520 with the Wahoo Bolt. I think if we look at 2018, the battle has kind of diverged a little bit. So we now have this low-end battle that's going on at the sub-$200 price point of the Edge 130, Lezyne Mega C and XL, the Stages L110, the Polar M460, and there's a bunch of others in that realm, but that's kind of the big four right now. That's going out sub-$200. That's really, really fascinating. And then we have at the higher end, basically $350 plus, this whole mapping thing going down, where we've got Sigma Rocks 12, which won the award here earlier on. That's what you're seeing right there. Very high-end display, mapping that whole end, kind of competing with Garmin at the high end. And then we have kind of slightly further down that spectrum, Stages with the L50 coming out, as well as the Hammerhead Crew that came out earlier this year. So it's really interesting to see like people challenging it at different areas. I do think that all these companies on the higher end are discovering that mapping is really, really hard. It's not easy to do mapping and navigation. That's something that I think Hammerhead's learned the really hard way over the course of the year. They started shipping their product back in February or something like that. And I'd say a fair chunk of this past year has been them trying to deal with routing and navigation type bug fixes. And that's something that it's going to be challenging for the up-and-coming companies to challenge Garmin on, because Garmin has what is effectively a decade of experience on cycling and mapping. And so these companies have to iterate very, very quickly to stay relevant. And we're seeing companies do that. Like I said, Hammerhead's been releasing updates every 2 to 3 weeks or so, which is good. Sigma's been releasing updates and staying engaged and keeping people involved. And so that helps a lot if they can kind of quickly troubleshoot and move forward on items. I think we're seeing power meter advances cooling off a bit. By cooling off, I mean completely and totally dead. There's been virtually no power meter advances this year in 2018. New products, sure, but not in terms of like stepping forward of some sort of power meter advances. And we're also seeing the kind of continued expansion of lighting products, which is cool. So like Bontrager had their new lights that came out this past summer, connected lights that were super small. Awesome example of that. Cyclic with their integrated bike cameras and lights as well. So kind of nice to see the different products coming on. There's plenty more lights out there as well. So I'm excited to see where this lighting trend goes in general. And it's nice to see it's more than just 1 or 2 companies. So Aero. Aero is the topic that everyone loves to talk about. And in this case, there's been a ton of progress on Aero, though very little of it tangible to the end consumer. So right now there are 8 announced Aero companies that I'm aware of. There are obviously more Aero companies that haven't announced themselves, but there are 8 announced companies that you can see up there. The top two, this is roughly ordered by when they were going to start shipping, or when they've at least announced shipping plans. If you haven't announced, then you're further down the pile. So in the case of like Argon 18 is actively shipping to consumers. PowerPod and VeloComp is supposed to start shipping yesterday or today. I haven't seen if they've actually done it yet, but that was the plan. And then you go down from there, shipping basically between this fall and sometime next summer is roughly the time frames there. But it's going to be challenging, and that's something that I've seen already in testing these devices. And I went 2 weeks ago with Robert Chung and Tom Anault, who, if you are familiar with the aero and kind of cycling technology industry, you know they're like the really smart dudes in the aero realm. That's the only way to describe them. Like, they are the grandfather of a lot of almost everything that you see in cycling aerodynamics comes from the work that Robert Chung has done. So we went to the specialized wind tunnel where you have a bunch of really smart aero dudes as well that just do aero all day long. That's all they do is aero stuff. And we took a couple devices in there and started figuring out how to test them. And I say not necessarily testing them, that was sort of our goal that we didn't really get to, but just to how to test these devices, because there's so much nuance to it. And as we started getting into it, we realized it's really complex. And I think the biggest takeaway from that entire day wasn't whether one device was accurate or another device was accurate or inaccurate. Instead, it was that the biggest challenge for these devices will be non-technical. It's going ahead and making a cohesive platform for that consumer that makes them understand aerodynamics. It is a mobile-first strategy, meaning that you have to use your phone as the first point of contact for dealing with that device. If it's a desktop strategy, it's not good. Like, that was one of the devices was desktop first strategy, and our heads were hurting by the end of the day. Like, it's just not convenient. Like, you think about you're outside with your bike, do you bring your laptop out? And what if you have a desktop computer? Like, it's just not easy to work on that sort of scenario. But as I started thinking about it more and more, I realized that in some cases, I'm not even sure the mobile phone is the best strategy for these devices either. I think the head unit is actually the best place for communications to the end user on these devices, and in particular, giving guidance to the devices. Because the whole challenge with aero is explaining to people how to test. So people in this room say, oh, the challenge with aero is getting accurate data. Yeah, that's not actually what I'm worried about. I'm worried about how you teach someone to test for aerodynamic gains. So your average consumer is going to pick up a $1,000 aero sensor and then going to go buy a new helmet, because that's all they know to do. They're like, oh, I'll buy a new helmet, that'll fix it. Is this faster? Maybe, maybe not. When in reality, if you talk to somebody in the aero industry, they will go through a whole list of things that you should try before you try a new helmet. Little subtle hand position things, moving your fingers 1 centimeter forward or 1 centimeter back, or shrugging your shoulders. That's the kind of stuff that you have to convey to users. So how do you teach users in this to go ahead and know to do these things and not just to keep on buying aero helmets all the time? And that's, I think, the biggest challenge, to go ahead and make that viable for a user. And one of the things I would think that would make the most sense is looking at something like a head unit. And if you look at, for example, Fitbit's Ionic and Versa lineup, and Adidas' SmartRun GPS in the past, if you went to the gym, they had these little videos that were on the app, and you could see on the app a video of a person doing a certain exercise, different routine in the gym, and that would guide you through your gym workout. I feel like that same sort of technology has to ultimately come to head units to guide people through aero testing. In other words, show someone how to shrug their shoulders, which may sound silly, but if you're talking aero, that's actually a big deal. Show someone visually how to do that on their head unit, and then say, now go ride for 10 minutes. And record that in the head unit, and have that head unit track that entire process, so that when you get to the end of your ride, you have this effective report that says, here is the 10 things that you just tried, or 5 things that you just tried at 5 minutes each, and here were the results of that from an aero standpoint. Until something like that happens, I think it's going to be really tricky for aero devices to catch on mainstream, because I think it's going to be challenging for consumers to know what to make of that. Certainly the slow twitchers of the world will figure this out, but you can't make an entire business just on selling to slow twitchers. It's just not viable. So, power meters, the past year. It was a quiet year. I mean, there was really no major new power meters out there this year from big brands, big power meter brands anyways, other than SRM. There was rebrands, like there was the FORIPISTA partnership with Specialized, for example, and there was Shimano kind of getting out there a bit more, and of course, Giant introduced their own lineup as well. But in terms of like the major legacy power meter brands, right, the PowerTaps, the Quarks, et cetera, it was a really quiet year. And so there was that element of it, and then there was the fact that there was no meaningful price drops. And I think like we saw Watt Team do a small price drop and stuff, but that didn't really have any impact on the competitive landscape. So it's something that it's definitely been fascinating to see that that industry has kind of flatlined. Not in terms of sales, obviously, because that's definitely going up, but in terms of innovation or in terms of price decreases or things that the companies really kind of tend to care about. We've also seen that some companies, we've also seen that companies like Favero and 4eyes, who aren't typically like who you would say are the power meter legacy powerhouses, right? They're not the Quark, SRM, PowerTap, et cetera. People have been around for 10 years. We're seeing these two companies almost leading the way on doing things like studies and talking about accuracy and talking about how they're testing, which a lot of other companies haven't. And I've certainly noticed that. Like I've certainly noticed the work that these two companies have done comparative to everyone else just saying it's accurate. So that's something that I think the other companies need to consider going forward because people are paying attention to those papers. Like the amount of media coverage that Favero got back this past spring with their big power meter accuracy thing was impressive. The same with the 4eyes and Specialized partnership on their power meter accuracy. People are paying attention to that kind of stuff. We also see a couple crowdfunded efforts out there today. IQ Squared is one of them. I think they're getting closer, but I don't see them shipping this year, realistically. And I'd say shipping, I know like a company can ship a product, but unless that product is actually functional and accurate, then you're just shipping a paperweight. Like if you just ship something that's inaccurate, then that's just like limits. So at this point, you gotta ship something accurate. So we'll see. Pricing stabilization, as you can see really clearly here, it's completely bottomed out this year in 2018. So this is like my annual graph of power meter pricing by brands. It's a complete eye chart, but the only thing you really need to know is pricing is going down. And at the bottom here in the last year and a half to 2 years, it's kind of flatlined out. Like that's where pricing is for now. Until you get a company like IQ Squared coming along that actually produces an accurate product at 149 euros or whatever it is they're trying to sell it for, then that chart won't change. You have to have someone come in and actually produce something truly accurate at a lower price point in order to shift that chart lower again. Trainers. This is the area where I think we've seen the most innovation in the cycling realm over the past year. And we've kind of grouped them into 3 different categories. We've got this sub $600 range of trainers now, which is mostly wheel-on trainers for now. I think that's like not going to stay that way that long. I think if we go to like 2019 and beyond, I think we'll see sub $600 direct drive trainers, but mostly wheel-on, accuracy at plus or minus 5%, again, for now. But more or less, when you get to sub $600 trainers, like there's like 4 trainers at that $599 price point, and frankly, they're all more or less the same. Like if I look at like a Kicker Snap, a Cyclops Magnus, Elite Rampa, and the Tax, whichever model is it, $599, I think Bushido, they're all like, it doesn't really matter to the consumer. There's nuances of each. Like there's some has a little bit better internal road-like feel, other ones have a little bit better climbing specs, other ones have a little bit better accuracy, but from a consumer standpoint, versus sub $900 range, so $899 price point, that's where things get really interesting. That's where we saw this year Wahoo come out with the Wahoo Kicker Core, which is essentially taking the 2017 Kicker that cost $1,200, making a silent and slicing $300 off the price. And that's done really, really well. Accuracy now in this price range is plus or minus 2.5% or better. We're seeing them all direct drive, no cassette included, but this is really that sweet spot for the vast majority of consumers. And then beyond that, at the $1,000 price point, you have trainers that have much higher gradients and tighter levels of accuracy. But I wouldn't want to be making trainers at this price point right now. Like you have to have, as I said there, you have to have something special in your trainer to justify more than $1,000 today in this marketplace. The trainers at $899 are so good that you have to have something substantially worthwhile to be justifying prices at $1,100, $1,200, $1,300, $1,400, and consumers are noticing. Now, that's not to say that you can't do cool things. There are companies doing cool things there. Like, for example, Kinetic with the R1 direct drive trainer has the rock and roll where it rotates back and forth at 1050. So an example of doing something cool. In the case of Wahoo, they've got integration with their climb units, so that's something that might justify that higher price. In the case of Tax, they have zero calibration required, the whole road feel concept of feeling cobblestone. So there are cases where you can justify higher prices, but by and large, I don't think consumers are going to keep on going to those higher price trainers for very long. Also seeing focus on indoor training bikes. So I talked a little bit about this last year when we first had the Watt Bike Atom out there, and then now over the last year we've got the Tax Neo Smart Bike, we've got the Elite FUORIPIsta, if I got it right, and then we have the Be Cool Smart Bike, and of course others working on smart bikes as well. And I think this is an interesting market. I'm not sure that all these price points, like 14,000 euros, makes sense, but I think they all fill their particular places in life. And I think that's something that I'm really looking forward to this particular market maturing a bit more. I would say, though, that my keys for a successful indoor smart bike are kind of listed there. It's got to make a clicking sound, which sounds like the most trivial thing ever. But when you shift an indoor bike, it has to click. It has to make a click sound just like you're on an outdoor road bike. Having an indoor bike that makes a mushy, like you try to go shift the gears and it's just like pressing this remote right here, doesn't work. Like it just doesn't feel right. You have to have some sort of display for gearing. Because of the fact that it's all electronic, if you can't see those gear display, it falls apart. And I know most apps are starting to add gear displays to them, but I still think having a small display on the unit itself is really, really critical going forward. USB ports for charging. All of us are using some sort of tablet or phone on their bike while they're on their bike. Having USB ports somewhere on that bike is important for charging. And then adjustability is, of course, really important as well. But we're also seeing this kind of expansion of trainer accessories, which is really, really fascinating. In the past, people have been doing things like rocker plates, and that was kind of based on what Kinetic did with the rock and roll trainer. And now we're seeing Cyclops getting into the rocker plate realm. We've seen Wahoo go with the climb that rises up and down. The Kinetic R1 kind of rotates side to side. So companies are looking at ways to make this whole experience more interactive and more interesting to people. And that's important. Like I think if you look at the entire trend of indoor training, it's to make it more interesting, to make it more engaging. And all these companies are doing this in one way or another. So like in the case of Tax Neo, it's physically vibrating the trainer to go ahead and feel those cobblestones or whatnot. So it is something, though, that right now, like the price point for most of these things are still too expensive. So you're moving from hobbyists that are developing their own rocker plates to going to like the 1%er category, right? If you talk about the pricing that Cyclops has been bantering around for this unit here is just as much as a new trainer, if not more than most new trainers in this particular price point. So that's a challenge for people. They're not going to spend $800 on something like this. That's the vast majority of the market isn't anyways. Trainer apps. So it's been really interesting watching trainer apps the past year. They're doing some really cool stuff. Like I think up until last 18, maybe like 12, 18 months, trainer apps were something you got in your trainer, you opened up the app, and it controlled the trainer, and that was it. Like it just set a set point for wattage and called it done, or it raised the grade and stuff. But now trainer apps are becoming your entire training platform. Like the line between a trainer app and a training log platform is blurring more and more and more. I mean, that's just, even look at Trainer Road's announcement last week around doing, forward-looking scheduling and training load and all that kind of stuff within their app. That line is super blurry these days, and I think that's what consumers kind of want. Like someone had kind of commented on one of the posts recently and said, I'm paying this much for my trainer app company, I'm paying this much for this and this much for this, and before they know it, they had like 5 bills of monthly costs just to ride their bike, and between that and Strava and everything else, and so they want that kind of consolidation to happen. It'll be interesting to see the point when these trainer apps start actually consolidating and merging, like physically merging companies with some of those training log platforms. And I think that's what we'll see as we go into 2019, to see some of those start to merge together. And frankly, I think it makes some sense. Like I don't want to see all competition go away, but I think there's cases where there's good synergies to be made between trainer log platforms and trainer app platforms. And we're also seeing cool stuff as well that are kind of thinking beyond the norm. Like today, Keynote announced they're doing a Couch to 5K program with the National Health Service in the UK. So for them, that's a pretty big deal to have the backing of that and have it be an entire national thing by the NHS. So that's a good example of pulling into the app, and people can get free access to it, and it's all kind of something that goes away from a traditional trainer app because it's actually running, in this case, people use the app on the treadmill and stuff. So it's kind of neat to see people thinking outside the box a little bit on some of this stuff. Past year for action cams. So last year when I talked about action cams, 360 action cams were like the in thing to do. GoPro had released their Fusion camera, Garmin had released their Verb 360, Insta360 had released some cameras. I mean, there's just a lot of 360 cameras out there. Everyone was trying to do 360. and now no one cares. The only way really to say it, like no one really cares. And I think no one cares because it's just too hard. The workflow around 360 cameras is too messy and too fiddly for most people. Even for me, if I want to use the GoPro Fusion or the VIRB 360, I've got to think through my entire workflow for how I'm going to get it up to something viewable, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or anything like that. And that takes a lot of time. Like in terms of the processing for that video takes a lot of time. They're big files, and the average consumer just doesn't want to deal with this. I think Rilo is probably the one exception that's close to figuring this out, close to the idea of having a camera that the goal isn't to output 360 video, but to output really cool and immersive flat video, like normal video. And their camera is doing really cool stuff. I just don't know if they can get beyond that marketing bubble. Like it's really hard because when they try to explain to a regular consumer that we've got a 360 camera that outputs non-360 content, people are like, what? And I think that's tough to get beyond that little edge there. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. I think GoPro, though, has kind of finally nailed it with figuring out what people want with the GoPro action camera, which is to not make their friends sick when they watch the footage. And if you look at the footage on the Hero 7 now, the stabilization, is it gimbal-like, as CEO Nick Woodman calls it? Not that far. But it's really, really good. It's really, really nice. And that's where consumers are getting to the point going, finally, I can use this footage for something and have it be useful. Also starting to see drones finally viable for sports tracking. So the two big ones out there right now in that sports tracking realm, the Skydio R1, which has 13 cameras on it to track. You may have seen some of my videos in the past around this. Super cool stuff. You can go through the woods and it follows you, and lots of fun. But DJI kind of finally countered this past last month with their Mavic 2. Also in the tracking realm, it actually can track you from more than 7 feet, which is a huge improvement over the past, where usually they would lose you before you even finish mounting the bike. It'd be like, oh, I've lost you. Now we're getting to the point where these cameras are getting closer and closer to being viable for sports tracking, which is super cool in my opinion. Kind of the last two areas I want to talk about, historically speaking, are some of the challenges that this industry's had of last year with bad studies. So seeing a lot of really bad studies come out, and it's definitely impacting people in this realm. So studies, but I mean both academic studies as well as non-official academic studies, where the studies are doing wrong things with your devices. This image is the perfect example of this, and this is something you'll see all the time. Anytime you want to see that YouTube thumbnail or whatever else, someone will put up a whole bunch of watches at once, right? And they'll be like, oh, look at all these watches. But you got to realize, and this is all the context of testing watches, this is the worst possible thing you can do for the accuracy of those watches. Without question, this is the worst possible thing. These watches are touching each other. They're going to impact each other from an optical heart rate standpoint, impact each other from a step standpoint, impact each other from a distance standpoint. It just all falls apart. But this is how Stanford tested their watches, right? Stanford, a relatively prestigious university in the grand scheme of universities, did all their testing on this, and then wonder why the results weren't very accurate. And this is a challenge. And I think it's a challenge for the industry to figure out how to help these academic and other media sources to test their devices. And it even gets worse than that. There's a case this past January or so, a study came out where they had contacted Firstbeat to use basically a module for tracking some of the heart rate and stuff like that in there, as well as some of the other data. And as part of that, Firstbeat provided this module on the side to help them do it from an academic standpoint. What then happened is they took that data and pulled it into their study, but didn't process it correctly. So they used the raw data as opposed to the processed data. So the accuracy was totally off. And then they presented that study and the accuracy from that accuracy data as being a normal consumer device. But that's not what the normal consumer sees. That's, if you're using raw data from a sensor and you don't process it like a normal consumer wearable would do, then you're not really measuring that wearable anymore. It's something totally different. This is where I would really caution companies in this space when you're working with academic researchers or any sort of study doing comparison testing to make sure you're giving them the end consumer product. When I'm testing stuff, I'm using whatever it is that's out of the box, and I'm using it in the way that it's supposed to be used. So I'm not putting more than one watch on my wrist. I'm not, compounding sort of things that gets inaccurate results. And this does impact you. This will especially be an issue as you get more into the medical realm over the next year, where people are going to try to do their own medical tests and really screw things up. And part of that is because, in all the work that I've seen thus far from the academic crowd, there are brilliant academics, but they don't know anything about technology in a lot of cases. They don't know anything about your products, and maybe they shouldn't have to, but you got to make sure you educate them on that. So what's coming down in the future here? I think obviously music services are the key to people's hearts. There's plenty of providers out there. Obviously they're roughly ordered in how big they are here. Spotify is a big one, and they get down to the very bottom with a bunch of companies you've never heard of before. Cats and dogs, not Deezer and iHeartRadio, but the very bottom one. But people are intensely loyal to a streaming provider. I am purely a Spotify person. I really don't care about anything else out there. I just want Spotify. People are also intensely loyal to their watches. And that's no more proven than last night. So last night I had my post go out on the new Spotify integration with Garmin, and as of this morning, these were just a handful of the responses of people basically saying, that's great, now give me something else. So basically, that's not great, give me Apple Music, give me Google Play, give me YouTube Music, give me Google Play, Google, right? It just goes on and on and on. Why isn't Pandora there? So you can see that these are all people that have, in the vast majority of cases, have Garmin devices, but don't have the streaming platform of their choice there. And so I think it's a bit of a race or a challenge for wearable companies to get as many streaming platforms as they can up there, because that's ultimately how they're going to convert and convince users. And especially as that price point continues to lower. So for example, the Fitbit Versa now is at $199 with music on there. And that's before we even talk like holiday sales, where it will invariably go lower than that. Who will be the first wearable company, mainstream wearable company that's not Apple or Google, to have Apple or Google services on their wearable? That'll be interesting to see if that will happen at all, right? Those are all areas that will be kind of those sort of milestones along the way, just like yesterday was actually a pretty big milestone in the wearables world that Garmin got Spotify. Like there was a lot of people, I can guarantee you, at Fitbit that had a very upset night last night that happened, right? So these are milestones, and for all we know, next week Fitbit could announce Google Music support, right? We don't know. So that's where it's going to be kind of a bit of an arms race over the next, I would say, 6 to 12 months for that to happen. The other question is, at what point does music become dial tone for these devices? Again, I talked about earlier, both Garmin and Fitbit have devices in the $200 price category, between $200 and $300, that have music on them. But they also have devices that are well above that in price point that don't have music on them. So at what point is that dial tone for music? Like what price point is that? Is that $200, $250, $300? Is there a case where you could have a $600 watch that doesn't have music if your $200 watch has music? I don't know. That's a tricky question. So wearables and medical devices. This is kind of almost like the music thing. In a lot of ways, this is like the same sort of arms race that we saw in music, now happening on medical devices. So we start off with the Garmin Fenix 5X Plus back in June, announcing pulse ox. Now, again, not technically a medical device, but certainly Garmin talked about their intentions to potentially certify it either for fun or for official, and see how it passes a medical device test. We then saw Fitbit with their Charge 3 in August with SPO2. We then saw Garmin 5 days later with the Vivo Smart 4 with SPO2. Apple Watch now doing EKG. Now, of course, there's asterisks on all of these things. Like every single one of these different wearables, when they talk about medical device type stuff, has a million asterisks on it. And it's the details and nuances of those asterisks that are really going to be kind of complex for companies to navigate. So like I saw, there's a really fascinating Reddit thread on a doctor that talks about Apple's EKG in the Apple Series 4 or Apple Watch Series 4, from a sensor standpoint, and where it compares to medical grade stuff. And it's really fascinating because you kind of read through all this and you realize at the end of that, one, yes, Apple has certified it in a very slim area compared to the entire realm of ways you can certify an EKG. But from a media standpoint and from a marketing standpoint, they've pitched it as basically having a hospital on your wrist. And so that's something where it's going to be really interesting to see how this works out over the next 6 to 12 months, where I think you're going to get a lot of cases of marketing by the companies themselves as well as retailers in pitching these as medical devices that they aren't necessarily for in certain areas. Like I just imagine walking into a Best Buy and having some gentleman there try to explain which device is a medical device and to what level. Like, that's going to get messy. It's going to get messy really, really quick. And so I'm interested to see how this works out longer term. I think it'll also become a bit of a war of the media PR stories of this device saved my life, which is what we see today. Like, Apple is the king of this in terms of seeding these media stories out there, and they don't ever come from Apple. That's what's so funny about this. Apple will seed with various media outlets a story about someone that says, oh, this caught some condition, and therefore it saved my life, right? And you see this like once every month or so. And how long do we start seeing these sort of things on Fitbit device or Garmin devices using that kind of medical grade data? It's going to be really interesting as well there. So going forward into indoor training, this is again the area that I'm actually most excited about in terms of potential. I think there's so much potential in indoor training, and I think it starts with understanding that the most important thing for an indoor training experience is how it feels. And I don't mean that like in terms of when you get on the bike, does it hurt or not? Because it's probably gonna hurt. I mean that like when you come away from that experience, are you excited about that experience? I think that's the reason why Zwift has succeeded. That's the reason why Peloton has succeeded, because people like that experience. They come away from that and go, that was awesome, I wanna do it again. I wanna do it tomorrow morning, I wanna do it right away, as opposed to, well, that sucked, I guess I could do it again, which is the typical indoor trainer experience. I think like if my recommendation to trainer companies is everyone in that indoor trainer industry needs to go ride a Peloton bike once. Ideally, at a Peloton studio in New York or wherever else the studios are. I think it's really important. I think there are so many things to be learned from Peloton as a platform and a bike to riding it once. Like I rode it back in August, I think I was in New York, and I rode it one morning, and it's just amazing how smooth that entire process is. From the moment you walk in the front door and you sign in, they say, okay, grab your shoes over there, and there's cycling shoes there for the right size, for your right size. And then from there, you take into a lobby, and there's a lobby where you're kind of waiting like you're waiting for a movie premiere, and you can chat with other people. And then the doors opened up, and the doors are opened up to a very timed event, right? So the doors open at a very precise time. Then you walk in, you get in your bike, and there's people inside this room that's like a little movie theater going ahead and helping you get in your bike and ensure that your bike is ready to go. If there's anything wrong with it, they're helping you out. Compare that to like a conventional, local gym spin class where you walk in and they're like, is your bike working? No? They're all full? Sorry. Pedal away, right? The level is so much higher there. Now, which isn't to say that everyone should be making Peloton bikes. I don't think that's the case. In fact, there was an interesting question at a trainer event that happened this past summer, where someone asked, how can we make the indoor trainer kind of companies, mostly the companies in this room, more like Peloton? And I like the answer that Mike from Wahoo Fitness gave, which is simply that I don't think we should. They're different markets. Like I think there's a lot to be learned from Peloton and takeaways that you can pull away from that. But I don't think you should try to make the traditional indoor like Zwift, Trainer Road, Sufferfest type thing Peloton. That's like saying that a motorcycle is the same as a moped. Yes, they both have two wheels and they both go on the road, but they're different markets. Can they learn from each other? Absolutely. But I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying make everything like Peloton. The majority of cycling innovation in 2019, at least in my opinion and guess, will be in indoor cycling. I look ahead to 2019, and I'm kind of like, aside from Aero, I don't know how much innovation we're going to see for the rest of the cycling tech realm. Again, tech being defined as like things with little gadgets in it. I think it's going to be kind of a quiet year, aside from Aero and indoor trainers. I do think, though, we're going to see a lot of good work on standardization, though. So I talked earlier about some of my concerns on standardization, but I am excited about seeing where advanced pedaling metrics goes. I think that's something that, based on how I've heard those meetings have gone this week, that will actually move forward and make tangible progress in the near term. I'm super excited about seeing Aero standardization up front. I think that'll be the key difference between the success of Aero devices compared to the success of running power devices. I think having a standard that they're going to start off from out of the gate will mean that those devices can kind of all act as one flotilla together going forward, as opposed to trying to win individual wars. But still, there's questions like, will there be standards around SpO2 data capture? That's something that more devices are doing. Should that be standardized into a device profile? Should there be some way to capture that data? And then how do you decide, or how do you determine whether the source of that data was a medical device or not? So if we go forward and we start certifying these medical devices, these devices medical grade, and you pull them into apps like Training Peaks or something else, and this one is considered medical quality data and this one isn't, how do you know that as the end user as a coach downstream from that, right? Those are all things to start kind of thinking about in terms of that data as you get beyond just kind of consumer general use devices. I think we're also going to see a really interesting kind of migration or advancement forward of trainer platforms themselves. People want these trainer platforms to be smarter about dealing with their day-to-day experiences. So right now, for example, on Trainer Road, you go ahead and you lay out your week ahead, and in doing that, or your schedule ahead, and you say, I can't work out on Mondays and Thursdays. And Trainer Road comes back and says, sure, here is your calendar for the next 4 months or whatever, where you're not working out on Mondays and Thursdays. But what happens when you get to today, a Thursday, where I'm traveling in Banff and the snow is out there looking pretty awesome and I can't run or I can't go for a ride? So in the case of Trainer Road and most of the platforms today, you either skip that workout or you maybe drag it to the next day or something like that. But you don't really know, most athletes don't know if that's the right move. Like, is the move to go ahead and cancel that workout? Is it to skip it? I don't really know. And I wonder though, do you get to the point where maybe there's better leveraging something beyond automation? Maybe there's leveraging actual real coaches. Maybe there's the idea that you can feed out to a pool of 200 coaches, and you say, hey, I'm going to skip this workout today, and it comes back 5 minutes later and says, okay, no problem. Can you do a 20-minute walk instead? Can you do this instead? What can you do? Where are you? Are you traveling? Are you a hotel? Give me here's some things that you could do. Something that maybe computer automation, I don't want to use the term AI because it's not the right term to begin with, and that's just a buzzword. But I would say, like, from something that computers can't figure out today, what can a real coach do better, and how can you integrate that in? And that's something that obviously the business models around that, the financial models around that are tricky, but I think there's huge potential there for training platforms to start incorporating real coaches at low cost levels, right? So I'm not talking like $100 a month, I'm talking like $15 to $30 a month, where maybe it's a premium plan that you get access to a real coach to help on rescheduling and things like that. To me, that would be really, really fascinating. So to kind of wrap things up a little bit, what are your biggest opportunities going forward? And I always say the biggest one to begin with is making users say, holy crap, right? And in some cases, and this is kind of an interesting distinction, in some cases, you can have one person say, holy crap, another person say, that's the stupidest thing ever. And a perfect example of that is Quark's tire pressure sensor, TireWhiz. That's something, it's a little pressure sensor, it goes on your wheels and it measures your tire pressure, and it costs $200. But depending on who you ask, it's either, holy crap, that's really cool, or that's the stupidest thing ever. If you ask a fat biker, holy crap, that's really, really cool, because they understand the importance of the tire pressure. You ask most road cyclists, they're like, it's the stupidest thing ever. But it's all right, because in that case, they made a product that someone said holy crap, and hopefully enough people that said holy crap will actually buy it to make it sustainable as a business. But still, they made a cool product and they advanced things forward. So don't be afraid of making a product that some people think is stupid, as long as enough people think it's good. If everyone thinks it's stupid, I probably can't help you. Focus on engaging users where they are. And this isn't really a product thing, but more of a company thing. One of the things I'm really excited about now is that every single company in this room now comments to questions on my site in the comment section, right? Whether there's 2,000 comments on the review or 50 comments on the review, every single company in this room now responds there. That's pretty cool. And more importantly, you're not just responding on my site, like it's nice that you respond on my site, but more importantly, you're responding in other areas. You're understanding the value of responding to your customers in the forums and the places they're talking about your products. Because if a happy user is happy, that's great. But if a user is upset and posting on the internet, it's really hard to kind of take that back. But what I've seen overwhelmingly is that when you in this room are responding back to upset users, users are generally surprised that you're actually responding somewhere other than their own support lines, and they usually are pretty happy about it when all's said and done, no matter how big a company you are. And I've seen that whether it be smaller companies, like I saw posts from North Pole today to some users, I saw some posts from Sigma today to some users, and even Garmin responding to some users across the board on things. And that's something that consumers are noticing. And I've seen like the level of upsetness, if you want to call that a metric, when something goes wrong, decrease substantially when the companies respond there in that particular area. Next, remember that you're measured against tech company standards, not traditional cycling and sports standards. As I said earlier, you have to think like a tech company. You have to act and interface with the tech world as a tech company. And then last but not least, as always, just simply make cool shit. If you do that, you'll win every single time. So thank you very much.